This week, we'll be discussing the criminal justice system in the United States. So when we think about the different components of the criminal justice system, there's a variety of pieces. The first is we have policing or law enforcement. We then have the court system, and then we have corrections. So corrections is the combination of individuals on probation, parole, or in jails and prisons. So probation and parole are both alternatives to incarceration. Probation, which is the largest component of the criminal justice system, so over 3 million individuals are actively on probation at any given time. It's in lieu of prison. So if individual commits typically a low level misdemeanor, they might receive a probationary period. So instead of going to prison, as long as they engage in certain activities such as community service, maybe drug treatment, they might be able to be put on a probationary period rather than having to go to prison. And as long as they complete certain steps, they won't have to go to prison. Slightly less than 1 million people are on parole. So again, this is in lieu of prison. This is early release. So individuals who have been in prison are released early and given parole. So similar kind of standards that they have to maintain to not go back to prison. So they might have to complete drug treatment. They usually have to check in with a parole officer every so often. And as long as they kind of get a job, have supported housing, and follow all of these steps, they are able to kind of be released from prison and not have to go back. 2.3 million people roughly are incarcerated in the United States any given day. And they are incarcerated in either jails or prisons. A lot of times these words are used interchangeably, but jails are typically run by local law enforcement agencies. So they might be run by cities or counties. And it's a lot of times most individuals who are in jails either have a short sentence, like less than a year, or they are awaiting trial. So when individuals are first arrested, if they are unable to kind of post bail, so pay a certain fine to be released, while they're awaiting trial, they are going to have to await trial while they're in jail. So about 75% of individuals who are in jails haven't actually been convicted of a crime. They're waiting for their trial to see if they're going to be convicted or not. Prisons are run either by states or federal government. And prisons are, once individuals have been convicted of a crime and it's a longer sentence, typically more than a year, they'll be sent to a prison. And prisons are really scattered throughout. So if they're being convicted of a crime within the state, they could be sent to anywhere, any prison in the state. So if it's in Kansas, they could go to any prison in the state of Kansas. Sometimes it's several hours away. A lot of prisons are located in rural areas because that's where more land is available. Okay, so these are the different components of the criminal justice system. The one thing to keep in mind, I think that this is not always known. The U.S. has a very high incarceration rate, so one of the highest in the world. But the positive note is that the incarceration rate is actually on the decline. In 1980, it was 310 individuals per 100,000 in the United States. That peaked to 1,000 individuals per 100,000 in 2008, and it has slowly been declining since 2008. So right now we have 860 individuals per 100,000 that are incarcerated. That is still a very, very high number. It's still one of the highest in the world, but it's not as high as it used to be. So that is positive. If we're going to look on the bright side, it increased exponentially between 1980 and 2008, primarily because of the war on drugs. So the war on drugs was a series of really tough on crime policies. So individuals who had different drug offenses would be sent to prison in lieu of instead of some other option. But some of those have relaxed, and those laws have relaxed. And we have more alternatives. Crime has also been decreasing. So crime has been declining since the 1990s. The combination of reform efforts and changes in crime patterns have resulted in lower rates of incarceration. And I would imagine we would continue to see that decline because these efforts have been maintaining. So we're going to talk about some specific reform efforts that have been implemented and some potential reform efforts that have not been implemented. Again, the thing to keep in mind when we think about reform happens at different levels. So we have 3 different levels of government. We have local governments, state governments, and federal governments. And the different components of the criminal justice system operate these different components. So policing and the court systems are typically run at the local level. So in order to make reforms, it really has to be initiated at the local level. So the federal government has some broader reform efforts, but it's hard to make widespread criminal justice reform at the federal level because the police and the court systems are typically run by local governments. So that's why we really need change at all 3 levels of government for really large changes to be seen in the criminal justice system. So when we think about police or law enforcement, that's police investigating crimes, arresting individuals, booking them for their crime. The court system is when people are actually tried by a judge or a jury and sentenced. And then the correctional system is where individuals are in jail or in prison or on probation or parole. And then once they're released, that's when we have re-entry services following their incarceration. So we're going to go through each of these different stages and discuss different reform efforts. So when we first look at policing reform efforts, we've heard a lot about this recently. There's always kind of ongoing conversations about how police can be reformed, specifically to reduce use of lethal force. So for class this week, you're going to read a short reading to look at different police reform efforts that have been proposed. And the thing to keep in mind is that of these 10, so of these 10 reform efforts, about 40% of police departments have initiated some of these since summer 2020. So since the George Floyd protests, about almost half of police departments haven't started to initiate some of these reform efforts. And again, when we talk about police departments, these are typically on the local level. So these are local police departments run by cities or counties. So you will learn more about these 10 in the reading. The next step in the criminal justice reform process would be looking at courts. So how can we kind of reform the efforts by which individuals are tried and sentenced? One that has really taken hold in different local police departments is the idea of cash bail reform. So cash bail is the process by which individuals who are awaiting trial, so they've been arrested, they're in jail waiting for their trial, they have to pay bail in order to be released. And the amount of bail varies based on the crime and how much money the individual has. So if this is like a billionaire convicted of a crime, they're going to have to pay several $1 million to be released because it's an amount that's going to make it so that individual, they want their money back. So you get a portion of the bail back once you actually show up for your trial date. However, this is very discriminatory to low-income individuals because it's much harder for low-income individuals to pay bail than higher-income individuals. Even though they try to fluctuate it based on income, low-income individuals, they might not be able to pay $1 towards their bail. So what ends up happening is these jails, about 75% of people in jail haven't been convicted of anything. They're waiting for their trial and they're unable to pay bail. So what's been proposed is to eliminate bail for nonviolent offenders. So because some individuals can end up waiting in jail for 2 years waiting for their trial, and if they're not convicted, if they're found not guilty, then they wouldn't need to spend a day in there. So to eliminate those disparities in individuals having to become incarcerated who haven't been convicted, there have been some efforts to eliminate cash bail systems. So some cities have started doing these, but again, these are kind of left up to each jurisdiction to do that. But specifically for nonviolent offenders, so individuals who might have like a drug conviction or a drug charge wouldn't have to wait in jail for their trial date, because trials sometimes can take, months to several years to come up. Some of the other reform efforts that have been implemented, but again, these vary by jurisdiction, are alternative courts. So these are alternative courts for special populations. So they have mental health courts. So individuals who have severe mental health issues, and that is kind of part of the reason they kind of did this crime, might be able to participate in a mental health court or a behavioral health court. Different jurisdictions call it different things. So that's where it would not be as formal of a process. They would kind of consider their mental health in the sentencing, and they wouldn't necessarily be sentenced to incarceration. They might have to go through some sort of behavioral health program. Maybe they might be sent to a psychiatric hospital and get assistance rather than having to go through the formal court process. A lot of jurisdictions also have juvenile court, so individuals under the age of 18, who again are going to be provided with some sort of alternative rather than having to go to be incarcerated into a juvenile justice facility. A lot of jurisdictions have also started adding drug courts. So drug courts are people with, especially if they have like this, it's their first or their second drug conviction or arrest and it's a misdemeanor. So individuals, especially like possession of marijuana, might be sent to a drug court. And again, rather than sending them to become incarcerated, they're going to kind of give them an alternative plan. So it might be that they have to complete drug treatment, that they have to complete some community service, some sort of intense supervision. They're going to be supervised by a parole officer or probation officer that they have to check in with. Ankle monitoring might be part of some of these courts. But these, again, all of these alternative courts, they're alternatives to incarcerations that are opportunities for individuals to receive treatment and assistance, some special service, rather than having to be incarcerated. So it's the idea that people don't receive as much treatment when they're in prison. So it's, if we can prevent them from being incarcerated, it's way cheaper. These courts and the treatment associated with them might cost a few $1,000s compared to $31,000, which is the cost to hold someone in a prison. So it's far cheaper, and it leads to better outcomes for these individuals when they actually receive treatment rather than just kind of being shipped off to prison. So the next step in the criminal justice process is corrections. So this is where individuals are actually in prison or jail. And what we've seen, at least on the federal level, the most recent reform effort is the First Step Act of 2018. So this was passed just a few years ago. And it has a variety of stipulations to try to help individuals create a better, more well-being for prisoners. So it's focused on individuals who are actually incarcerated. So it helps place individuals closer to family. It allows for more good time efforts, good time credits, so people could potentially be released early, compassionate release for terminally ill individuals, de-escalation training, and so forth. So it's just trying to improve their well-being for individuals who are incarcerated. Because again, kind of recognizing that simply locking someone up isn't going to necessarily help them. So if we want to help them be successful, kind of helping them maintain some of those social supports. So when they're out, they'll maintain those family relationships. They have life skills classes, which will help them be successful. So if we spend more money on the front end, we won't be spending as much money when they get re-incarcerated. So the other component of that is release. So when people are actually released, what services do we have in place? We don't have a ton of services in place. So the Second Chance Act was passed a few years ago, and it allocates $362 million to help people reintegrate into society. So these are called re-entry services. So when people leave prison, re-enter society. These are services to help them. So we have roughly 2 million individuals who are incarcerated. We're spending about $300 million on them to re-enter society. So that's roughly $150 per person. So we're not spending a ton of money per person if you look at it like that. So the money that we need for re-entry needs to be a lot higher than it actually is. But it's a first step. We need second steps now. So this is Second Chance Act. So when people are released, it funds programs that help people re-enter society. Because if you think about when someone leaves prison, they have a really hard time finding a job. They have a really hard time finding housing. They have probably don't have very many social supports. Maybe they've lost some ties with family and friends while they've been incarcerated, especially if they've been there for a really long time. They might not know how to use technology, which would limit their job opportunities. They probably didn't have access to a lot of education, so maybe they don't even have a high school diploma. So these are all things that people need help with. So with reentry services, with the Second Chance Act, that goes to a variety of programs, such as case managers to help people find jobs, help them find housing, maybe supported housing. So a case manager is actually living with them. It might teach them how to use a computer and other life skills classes once they're actually released. The other initiative that is starting to take hold in different states, it's called Ban the Box. So ban the box. So if you think when you are completing a job application, a lot of times those job applications say, please check this box if you have a felony conviction. So what some states have started doing is banning the box. So they're making it so that employers cannot require individuals to disclose felony convictions on job applications. So only on job applications. This doesn't prevent individuals, this does not prevent employers from asking about felony convictions during interviews, from doing background checks to see if someone has a felony conviction. All it does is it prevents employers from getting criminal history on the actual job application. So this is all it does is provides people with a criminal background a foot in the door. So they are able to get the interview and then disclose the criminal history and provide a story, a background, what happened. And they can also talk about their experience. So it just makes it so that application isn't immediately thrown out. It's one small step to try to help individuals with a felony conviction get a job, because they have really, really high rates of unemployment. And because of those high rates of unemployment, they're more likely to engage in additional criminal activity and have higher recidivism rates. So they're more likely to commit another crime because there's high rates of individuals. Once you have one criminal conviction, you have a high rate of a second one. So research has shown that when they have a job and when they have good housing, they're less likely to engage in additional crime. So all it does is help kind of break that stigma of the criminal record to get them the interview and the opportunity to explain what happened. It doesn't prevent them from not getting the job because of the criminal history. So the employer can still kind of discriminate against them later, but it simply gets them in the door. So Kansas has not banned the box. However, certain counties within Kansas have, or certain jurisdictions. So Topeka, Wichita, and Wyandotte County have all banned the box on public sector applications. So any government jobs, they can't ask about criminal history on the job application. All states surrounding Kansas have also banned the box. So Missouri, Colorado, Oklahoma have all said on public sector applications, so on all government jobs, we're not going to allow them to ask about criminal history. You can still, even like private sector applications, so any non-government businesses would still be able to in these states, but at least it's a step forward to try to increase employment rates amongst individuals with a criminal history. Again, I'm just bringing us back to this chart we saw before. So these different reform efforts have started to kind of turn the dial on the number of people incarcerated, by providing alternatives to incarceration, helping them get more jobs, providing them skills, life skills training in drug treatment and mental health treatment, in lieu of incarceration. We've been able to kind of, again, turn the dial and pull back the number of people who are incarcerated. And if we keep going with these reform efforts, I think those numbers are just going to keep going down and down, which is positive for everyone because it's really expensive to have someone incarcerated. Lots of consequences for the individual, consequences for society. So it's a win-win when we're able to gear individuals towards needed services rather than just kind of shipping them off to prison.